In the intellectual history of the 20th century, few texts detonate with the force of Thomas Kuhn's 1963 monograph, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, emerging from an era dominated by the austere logic of positivism and the stock rationalism of Karl Popper. Kuhn's work presented a vision of science that was profoundly historical, deeply human, and unsettlingly dynamic. It was a slender volume that redrew the entire map of the philosophy of science, replacing the smooth, linear ascent toward truth with a fractured landscape of placid consensus, jarring crisis, and revolutionary upheaval. Kuhn, a physicist by training who turned to the history of science, accomplished something remarkable. He made philosophy accountable to history. By examining how science was actually practiced, he exposed the vast chasm between the idealized image of the scientific method and the complex, messy, and psychologically charged reality of scientific change. The book's central thesis, that science progresses through a series of paradigm shifts, has since permeated our intellectual and cultural lexicon, providing a new language for understanding profound conceptual transformations of all kinds. To fully appreciate its impact, one must first comprehend the world it entered and the philosophical orthodoxies it so effectively dismantled. Before Kuhn, the philosophy of science was largely an ahistorical discipline. The dominant school of thought, logical positivism, born from the Vienna Circle in the 1920s, sought to ground all meaningful knowledge in empirical observation and logical analysis. For figures like Rudolf Carnap, the goal was to construct a perfect, formal language for science, purging it of all metaphysical ambiguity. Science was seen as a process of verification, of accumulating confirmed facts that would build, brick by logical brick, an ever more complete edifice of truth. A powerful alternative came from Karl Popper, whose 1934 work, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, proposed a more dynamic model. Popper argued that the defining characteristic of science was its method of falsification. A theory was scientific if it made bold, tests or predictions that could, in principle, be refuted by evidence. For Popper, science was a heroic saga of conjecture and refutation, a continuous cycle where theories are bravely proposed and ruthlessly tested, with each falsified theory bringing the scientific community one step closer to the truth. In both the positivist and Popperian accounts, science was cumulative, rational, and progressive, guided by universal rules of logic and evidence. The history of science was merely a chronicle of this triumphant march. Kuhn's own intellectual revolution began with a moment of historical empathy. Tasked with teaching a course on mechanics to non-scientists, he immersed himself in the writings of Aristotle. He initially found Aristotle's physics to be bafflingly, almost laughably, wrong. It appeared to be a collection of elementary errors. The breakthrough came when Kuhn learned to inhabit Aristotle's intellectual world, to see nature through his conceptual framework. He realized Aristotle was a brilliant observer and logician. His framework was different, a coherent system built on different assumptions. What had seemed like error was in fact a different way of seeing. This experience was the genesis of structure. It suggested that the history of science was a sequence of distinct, self-contained worldviews, and that the transition between them was the central mystery to be explained. The linchpin of Kuhn's entire conceptual apparatus is the paradigm. The term itself is famously rich in meaning, a fact Kuhn later acknowledged. In its broadest sense, a paradigm represents the disciplinary matrix, the entire constellation of beliefs, values, and techniques shared by the members of a given scientific community. This includes metaphysical commitments about the fundamental constituents of the universe, such as the corpuscular philosophy of the 17th century. It also encompasses shared values, like a preference for quantitative predictions. More narrowly and more powerfully, a paradigm is an exemplar, a concrete, universally recognized scientific achievement that provides a model for future research. Newton's Principia serve as the exemplar for generations of physicists, defining legitimate problems and the accepted methods for solving them. Within a mature paradigm, the daily work of science begins. Kuhn called this normal science. Far from the heroic Popperian ideal of constant critique, normal science is a deeply conservative enterprise. Its practitioners engage in puzzle solving, an activity predicated on the supreme confidence that a solution to the puzzle exists. The paradigm provides the rules of the game and the assurance of a successful outcome. The goal of normal science is articulation and extension. Scientists work to improve the fit between the paradigm and nature, determining significant facts like planetary positions, refining the values of physical constants, and developing new applications of the theory. It is a period of immense cumulative progress, but progress confined entirely within the conceptual boundaries established by the paradigm. Inevitably, however, the process of puzzle solving yields results that resist assimilation. These are anomalies. An anomaly is a puzzle that, despite repeated and skilled effort, remains unsolved. At first, the scientific community may ignore them, shelve them for future work, or devise ad hoc modifications to the paradigm to account for them. The elaborate system of epicycles and deference in late Ptolemaic astronomy represents a classic response to accumulating anomalies in planetary motion. As anomalies proliferate, or as a particularly stubborn one strikes at the very core of the paradigm, confidence begins to erode. This marks the onset of crisis. During a period of crisis, the rules of normal science are relaxed. Scientists may begin to engage in profound philosophical debate, something they shun during periods of consensus. Competing articulations of the paradigm emerge, and extraordinary science begins, characterized by bold and speculative theorizing. Crisis provides the fertile ground from which a new paradigm can emerge. The transition to this new paradigm is a scientific revolution. For Kuhn, this is a moment of profound, non-cumulative rupture. The new paradigm is a reconstruction of the field from new fundamentals, a process that changes the very standards of evidence and explanation. The community that embraces the new paradigm sees the world differently. Lavoisier's discovery of oxygen, for example, was more than the identification of a new gas. It was a complete reconceptualization of chemistry. Where Joseph Priestley, working in the phlogiston paradigm, saw dephlogisticated air, Lavoisier saw oxygen. They performed similar experiments but saw different things. This shift in perception, this Gestalt switch, is a central feature of a revolution. This leads to Kuhn's most controversial and philosophically significant concept, incommensurability. If rival paradigms represent different worlds, then there is no neutral language or common measure by which to adjudicate between them. Proponents of competing paradigms, in a very real sense, talk past one another. Kuhn identifies several layers to this idea. There is methodological incommensurability, where paradigms disagree on the set of problems that need solving and the standards for a valid solution. There is also semantic incommensurability, where key terms retain their names but acquire new meanings. The term mass, for instance, refers to a conserved quantity in Newtonian physics, an absolute property of matter. In Einsteinian relativity, mass is interconvertible with energy and is relative to the observer's frame of reference. A Newtonian and an Einsteinian physicist using the word mass are using the same label for different concepts. The consequence incommensurability is profound. It challenges the traditional view of scientific progress as a steady convergence on truth. A revolution involves gains, but it can also involve losses, a phenomenon later termed Kuhn loss. A new paradigm might solve the crisis-provoking anomalies of its predecessor, while failing to explain phenomena the older paradigm handled with ease. Progress, in the Kuhnian model, is directional. Science progresses from primitive beginnings and away from states of crisis. The idea that it progresses towards some fixed, ultimate truth about nature becomes problematic. If reachable, the reception of the structure of scientific revolutions was immediate and intense. The book became a focal point for the roiling debates in post-positivist philosophy. The most trenchant critiques came from the circle around Karl Popper. At a famous 1965 symposium in London, Popper and his followers accused Kuhn of portraying science as an irrational process, governed by mob psychology. If paradigm choice is a conversion experience, a leap of faith from one incommensurable worldview to another, then what separates scientific change from religious or political conversion? The charge of relativism was laid firmly at Kuhn's door. He seemed to suggest that the replacement of one theory by another was a matter of social and psychological persuasion, a contingency of history, with logic and evidence playing a secondary role. Kuhn spent much of his subsequent career clarifying and defending his position, most notably in the postscript added to the second edition of Structure in 1969 and in later essays. He resisted the label of irrationalist, arguing that he was describing the historical reality of science, a reality that philosophical idealizations had ignored. He sought to provide a more nuanced account of paradigm choice, introducing a set of shared cognitive values that guide scientists during a revolution. These values include accuracy, consistency, broad scope, simplicity, and fruitfulness in opening new avenues of research. While these values are shared, their application is inherently subjective. Two scientists, both committed to accuracy, might weigh its importance differently or disagree on which of two competing paradigms better exemplifies it. This provided a basis for rational persuasion, a middle ground between algorithmic proof and pure conversion, though it failed to satisfy his most ardent critics who demanded a more robust, universal logic of theory choice. The intellectual lineage of Kuhn's work is as important as its legacy. His historicist approach was deeply indebted to earlier thinkers who swam against the positivist tide. The Polish microbiologist and philosopher Ludwig Fleck, in his 1935 book Genesis and Development of a Scientific Fact, had already developed a remarkably similar sociological model of science. introducing concepts like thought collective and thought style that prefigured Kuhn's paradigms and scientific communities. Kuhn acknowledged Fleck's profound influence late in his career. The work of Gestalt psychologists like Wolfgang Kerher informed his understanding of perception and the idea of the Gestalt switch, while the developmental psychology of Jean Piaget provided a model for understanding conceptual change as a transition between distinct stages. The influence of Kuhn's work, in turn, has been immense and pervasive within the history and philosophy of science. It sparked a historical turn, inspiring detailed case studies of scientific episodes that tested, refined, and sometimes challenged his model. Thinkers like Imre Lakatos, with his methodology of scientific research programs, and Larry Lawton, with his concept of research traditions, attempted to build more rationalist historical models that could account for the dynamics Kuhn described without succumbing to what they saw as his relativism. Perhaps the most radical extension of Kuhn's thought emerged in the field of science and technology studies, or SDS. Scholars in the Strong programme at the University of Edinburgh, such as David Bloor and Barry Barnes, took Kuhn's emphasis on the social dimensions of science to its logical conclusion, arguing that all scientific beliefs, true or false, successful or unsuccessful, should be explained in the same sociological terms. Beyond the academy, the phrase paradigm shift escaped its technical confines to become a ubiquitous, almost cliched, term in business, politics, and popular culture, often used to describe any significant change, a development that Kuhn himself viewed with a certain academic amusement. Ultimately, the structure of scientific revolutions endures because it fundamentally and irrevocably altered our image of science and the scientist. It replaced the portrait of the scientist as a lone, detached observer applying a universal logical method with a far more compelling picture of a practitioner embedded within a community, bound by a shared tradition, and working to solve puzzles defined by that tradition. The book reveals science as a profoundly human endeavour, characterised by long periods of dedicated, conservative work punctuated by moments of revolutionary crisis and breathtaking conceptual leaps. Kuhn showed that the history of science is a history of ideas, and that this history moves with a rhythm of its own, a rhythm of stability and convulsion. While decades of scholarship have added layers of complexity and critique to his model, the central Kuhnian framework continues to shape our discourse. He provided the vocabulary and the narrative structure for understanding science as a dynamic, historically contingent, and revolutionary process. The debate over the rationality and progress of science continues, but it does so on the ground that Kuhn first cleared. His work stands as a testament to the power of a single idea to reconfigure an entire intellectual field, forcing us to see the familiar landscape with entirely new eyes.